Hello everyone and welcome to my channel. Whether you're a returning subscriber or brand new to the channel, welcome. I'm so happy that you're here. The miniature that I'm making in today's video is probably the most challenging and complicated miniature that I have ever made. And I have to admit there was times when I thought that maybe I had just bitten off a little bit more than I could chew because I wasn't at all sure I was going to be able to pull it off. However, this piece was so important to the homestead house that I couldn't bear to leave it out. Now, most of the stories for the homestead build have been centered around my grandmother. When I think about the house and when I think about the farm, she is the memory that connects me to that place. However, there was also two very important men in her life. One of them was her son, my Uncle Alec, who I will talk about in another video, and the other, of course, was my grandfather. Now, I never had the opportunity to meet him because he passed away long before I was born. But when I listened to stories from my dad and from my aunts, they all told me what an incredibly kind and wonderful person that he was. So my grandfather was very musical. He loved to listen to music and he loved to play music. And at some point, probably in the 30s, he managed to get his hands on a Victrola. Now, there was no electricity in the house at that time. This was a Victrola that had a hand crank, and he brought it home, and I'm sure the family enjoyed hours and hours of music from that Victrola. But he also built a stand for the Victrola. So he built a cabinet that the Victrola sat on. The cabinet had drawers where all the cylinders were stored, and that Victrola and stand, I'm happy to say, are still in our family. So this tutorial is dedicated to my grandpa. As always, you'll find your cutting instructions in the description box below. We'll have a quick peek at the materials that you'll need for this build, and then we'll get started. So here's what I used for the Victrola. I used three different widths of wood. I used the 3/32 of an inch for the bulk of the cabinet. I used the 1/16 of an inch for the drawers, and then I also used this very thin veneer wood, which is I think 1/16 of an inch or just a little over 1 millimeter for a lot of the finishing pieces. You'll need some wood glue. If you apply your wood glue with toothpicks, you'll need some toothpicks. You'll need to decide whether or not you're going to stain or paint. I opted to stain the piece, so I have some wood stain, but then I also have a selection of paint for painting the tiny details of the Victrola itself. So I used gray and silver, a beige, and then a really nice bright blue for those pieces. I used some floral wire as well. I have the 16 gauge, which is a little bit thicker wire, and a piece of the 30 gauge, which is a little bit thinner. You don't need to use floral wire. If you have other wire on hand that you want to use, that's fine. But you'll probably need a pair of wire cutters to cut those into the right size. You will also need a way to drill a small hole in a couple of the pieces. I have this little hand drill that I use that works quite well. You'll probably need some clamps or some heavy books to weight down some of the pieces when you glue them together. And I also find that using some painter's tape helps with that job as well. For the very tiny intricate details of the Victrola itself, I use some polymer clay. I use the type that you have to bake, so this is the FEMA polymer clay, and it works actually really well. For the handles, I've just chosen to use a couple of wooden beads and then a couple of straight sewing pins or dressmaker pins as well. I've also, for the hinge, used just a little white piece of fabric. I also have a few pieces of cardstock and paper. You'll need a little piece of black, some silver, and then just some white copy paper. And then, of course, your basic tools, your ruler, pencil, X-Acto knife, and a paintbrush in order to do your painting. And that's it. So let's get started on the Victrola. We're going to start by putting the lower cabinet together. So you'll need your pieces marked A, B, and C for this part of the tutorial. So on piece B, we're going to measure where the shelves will go because there are two drawers for this cabinet. So we'll start at the top and work our way down, and I would make those measurements on both sides. So we're going to start with our first mark or our first measurement at 22.5 millimeters from the top. Your second one will be at 43 millimeters from the top, and your third one will be at 50 millimeters from the top. Make those measurements on both sides and draw a line across. I'll move on now to pieces marked A. So these are our front and back piece. So for your back piece, the measurements are exactly the same as what were on your pieces B. So that's 22.5 millimeters, 43 millimeters, and 50 millimeters. What I've added on are two other measurements along the bottom. So going from your outside edges inwards, the bottom measurement will be 4 millimeters on either side, and your top measurement will be 6 millimeters from the ends. And then you'll just draw a line across on the diagonal from the 6 millimeter mark down to the 4 millimeter mark, and then we're going to cut that piece out. The last A piece is our front piece, and it does have different measurements from the back because we're going to put our drawer openings on this piece as well. So I'm going to give you the measurements for the front piece. It's going to sound like a lot, but once you have measured those out and drawn the lines, it'll make cutting out those spaces for your drawers much easier. So on the long side, so going from the top to the bottom, you will place your first mark at 11.5 millimeters, 22.5 millimeters, 32 millimeters, 43 millimeters, and 50 millimeters, and draw those lines across. Then we're going to do measurements going the other direction as well. So this would be along the short sides. Your measurements will be 4.5 millimeters, 29.5 millimeters. Do that on both sides and draw your lines across. And what you should end up with then is two squares, and that's the area that you're going to cut out for your drawer opening. We're also going to do the same measurements on the bottom as we did on the other piece A on the back piece, where we're going to go in 4 millimeters from each side, and then on the 50 millimeter mark, you go in 6 millimeters. Draw those diagonal lines across and cut that piece out. Now that all the guidelines are drawn, we can start putting it together. So I've got my back piece, which is the piece A, and I'll start with just one piece of the side piece, which is piece B, and we're just going to attach that at a 90-degree angle on the edge on top of the back piece. And make sure that you've got that the right side up so that the lines match. Next, we'll slide those 4 shelf pieces into place. So these are going to sit with the long edge because one edge is slightly longer than the other, and that long edge is going to sit against the side piece because you want the top or the short side to be flush with the top of your side piece. And I'm going to slide my first one right at the top. Your next one is going to sit below the line that you've drawn. So again, we'll put glue on 2 sides. And our third shelf is going to sit below your third line. So you can darken these lines up just so you can see. So if you can see, so our top one is flush, the second one is below this measurement line, the third shelf down is below this measurement line. The last one is going to fit flush with this cutout edge. So it's actually, my lines have worn off, I'm afraid. But that last measurement that we did is right here at the top of those legs. So this is going to sit actually now to the top of that line. Our next piece will be that second side B, and that's just going to sit on top of the back, just like the other side did, and press up against these shelves like that. I'm going to put some good weight on there, squeeze them together so that they dry nice and tight. And then lastly, of course, we'll put the front on. So our glue is going to go on basically all of the exposed edges that you see here. And I'm going to wrap some masking tape around there just to hold it until the glue is completely dry. In between the cabinet and the housing for the Victrola, there was this beautiful layered piece that separated the two. And so that's what I'm going to be creating next. So I'm just using the thinnest wood I have, which is just a 1 millimeter veneer. And there are 6 pieces, and each piece is just slightly smaller than the piece below it. So I'm going to be gluing these together 2 at a time. It's very important with this thickness of wood that you clamp it really well or weight it really well. There's only about a millimeter difference in the 2 sizes, and so you really need to be careful about getting it even all the way around on all 4 sides. And then I'm going to be using clamps. If you have some weighted objects like a book or some blocks or something that you want to weight yours down with, that's fine. But clamp it really well or weight it really well and give it a chance to dry. So I'm going to go ahead now and attach that little pyramid that I made to the top of the cabinet. I'm going to use some masking tape to make it nice and tight while it dries. I'm going to put the drawers together next, and then the bottom part of this base will be finished. So this is very simple kind of drawer. I've got a base, 2 side pieces, a back piece, and then the drawer front. So you will need pieces O, P, Q, and R. So all of the pieces are going to stand on top of the base. So we'll start with the back piece first. So this is piece O and this is piece P. We're just going to lay that on top of the base at the back. All right. Once your back piece is on, we'll add the 2 side pieces and they'll sit inside of that L shape. So they will sit like this. You can see I've drawn some little lines on this front of the drawer. I've come down on the long sides. I've come down 2 millimeters on each side. And then from the short side, I've come in 2.5 millimeters. And that box that's left in the middle is the same size as the front of this drawer. So that will help me place that drawer in the center and will keep the 2 drawer fronts even and level when I put them into the cabinet. We'll need to make 2 of those. I'm going to work on the housing for the Victrola next. So starting with our wood pieces, you'll need 2 pieces marked D, your piece E, F, and G. Now you'll see that I have drilled a hole in one of the side pieces, which is piece D. And in that hole is where the hand crank will go for the Victrola. So for the hand crank, I'm just going to fashion that out of a piece of wire. Whatever wire you have is fine, as long as the hole that you've drilled is the same circumference or the same diameter as the wire that you're using. So I just went in, this is 28 millimeters on the long side, so I went down 14 millimeters and in 3 millimeters. I'm putting the side pieces off to the side for a second, as well as piece G, and we'll just work first of all with your base, which is piece F, and the back piece, which is E. Now this E piece is going to sit on the outside of the base, so basically butting up against the back. We'll just slide piece E right up against the back of it. Next we'll add the side pieces. The one that you've drilled the hole in, make sure the hole is towards the top of the box. And that's just going to sit in that L shape on top of your base. Before I attach the last piece, I want to install the grill that was in the front. So this grill, of course, allowed the sound to come out from the Victrola. And so I'm just using a piece of silver cardstock, and I've cut it to fit this area here, but not going all the way to the top, because I do want to have this little piece sitting in on the top piece here. So when I cut that piece of cardstock, I added 2 millimeters to each side, and I just scored in on that 2 millimeter mark all the way around, because that is going to sit then at a 90-degree angle and will allow me to glue it into place. You can see also on the back that I've put a piece of painter's tape, and I have traced out where I'm going to put the grill and where it's going to be scored. Let's bring that a little closer. When I cut it, I'm going to cut it on the side with the masking tape. And that masking tape is just going to help to keep everything together, help keep it from tearing, because it's some pretty intricate cutting that needs to happen here. And I don't want to accidentally tear through any of these tiny pieces if I can help it. So that's the goal. So I'm going to take my X-Acto knife. I've already started cutting a few of them just to make sure that it worked. But I'm going to finish cutting those now, and I'm just going to cut little slits about 1 millimeter apart all the way across, and I'm going to leave about 2 millimeters on each side. So I don't want to go all the way to the top or the bottom. And when I say top or bottom, I mean not counting this little 2 millimeter piece that's going to be bent back and glued. So we'll start cutting here. Okay, so I'm just going to fold back those 4 edges, those scored edges. And I would just leave that tape on there. There's no reason to take it off. You won't be able to see the back. And then you can take your toothpick or a pair of tweezers and just go in and push down that piece that you scored off, just to make sure it sticks to the housing. And then the top side of that grill is going to glue onto your piece G. Behind this grill in the picture, you can see this little cone, which of course helped to enhance the sound. And so again, I've just made that out of some cardstock, some silver cardstock. And I just made a little cone. It's about 15 millimeters across and probably, oh, I'm going to say maybe 10 millimeters in diameter. But I'm going to squish it down just a little bit because the one in the picture is not completely round. It's kind of an oval shape. And then right where I've glued that cone together, I'm going to add some more glue and we're going to put it inside the housing. I'm just going to position it as much as I can into the middle and up gently against that grill. While the glue is drying on those, I'm going to fashion my piece of wire into a handle. So I'm just making two 90-degree bends. So one here, so that's an L shaped, and then another one about halfway in this distance going back out the other direction. So you should be left with this shape, and one of these sides is going to go into the box and the other side is going to become the handle. So rather than trying to fashion a wood handle for something that tiny, I'm just going to take some paper and start wrapping it around the handle. So I've cut, this is about 1/8 of an inch in width. You probably only need, oh, maybe 50 centimeters, 60 centimeters, somewhere in there. But basically just starting with some glue. Basically, we'll just start wrapping it. And so now you have a nice paper handle, and you can paint that if you wish. I will be painting this green wire silver, and I'll be painting the paper a light tan brown color. So you can measure to get a more accurate measurement than probably what's in the cutting instructions for this little piece. So basically you're going to measure about 2/3 of this space. So for me, that is about 18 millimeters by 16 and a half millimeters. And so I'm going to cut a piece of wood that will fit just in this 2/3 section inside of this frame. So this is the piece we just cut. I have cut a little hole the same size as the one that I did on the side of the housing, because this Victrola had this, it was a pipe, but I'm going to use wire. I'm going to use the same 12 gauge floral wire that I used for the handle, but there was a pipe that came up from the bottom and then came towards the front. So I've drilled that little hole so that I can put the pipe in as well. But before I do anything else with this little piece of wood, I want to paint it black because that was the color of the housing, and I don't want to try and paint it after everything is together. I want to be careful not to paint the sides. This little piece fits in quite nice and snug into the housing, and sometimes even a layer of paint will make it too big for the space that you need to put it in. So I'm just going to paint the top of it. I painted all of the pieces that I need for now, and I just want to give you a quick overall of what I've done. So that base piece for the Victrola took 2 paints of coat, and then I also put a coat of podge over top. When I was painting it, or after I'd put the 2 coats in, I just took a toothpick and dropped it into that hole and gave it a little bit of a turn. I do not want any paint residue in that hole that's going to affect my ability to put the wire in afterwards. I also have painted the handle that I made. And so anytime I'm painting silver, I always start with a coat of gray. I find that silver metallic paint doesn't adhere really well. So this is the winding handle. I've painted the paper that I put around there just a brownish beige color. And then in the Victrola, there's also this rod that goes along the front. I'm just using 30 gauge floral wire for that. I don't know exactly how long that needs to be yet, so I've just painted more than I know I need, and then I'll snip off what I need after. And again, one coat of gray and then one coat of the metallic. This Victrola ran on these little blue cylinders. They had a look and a size of what a Pepsi can looks like, kind of this bluish kind of look to it. So I've painted these with 2 coats of this purpley blue color. And then I've also added a coat of the glossy podge because they did have a shine to them. And then on the end of those, they connected to the Victrola with this other smaller cylinder, which will glue onto the side. I do have one more little part to make for this, but I did want to paint that silver because that's what it is in the picture. And then the last piece is this piece of pipe that comes out of the back of this base. So that's where this is going to attach into. And it kind of comes over top of the cylinder, and it has a couple other little things that I'll need to attach to it. But for now, that's the painting that I can do. So we're going to start kind of putting this all together, and I'll show you the other little pieces that I've made as well and give you a quick overview on how I've made them. I also wanted to show you a couple of other little pieces that I made. These were pieces on the base of that Victrola or parts of the Victrola which were made out of either plastic or it looks like one of them might even be metal. Pieces that you wouldn't necessarily have in your collection, right? And so what I've done is I've just recreated them out of polymer clay. Now, I'm no expert at polymer clay. And so all I did was the best I could to make it look as reasonably similar to the original pieces as I possibly could in the smaller scale. And so this is a FEMA clay that you bake afterwards. And so um, you'll see when I put the picture up, maybe I'll put a picture up now so that you can see. So this one would be on the left-hand side of that base and is part of the device that holds the cylinder. And I also had this little metal bar that goes in front. And so these little guys are just to hold that metal bar down. So there'd be one on each side. And then this piece sat over top of the bar. And then it had a couple of little, looks like a fork coming out from the top, which connected then to this wire. The last thing is this little front grill that also sat on the top. And these two pieces sit together as part of the top of the platform. And this little guy I just made out of black cardstock, and I used the same technique as I did with the silver grill in the front, where I just covered it in painter's tape on the back, drew out where I wanted to cut out the slits, and then also made sure that I had enough room on each side so that I could attach that in and glue it in. Okay, it's time to try and put all this together, so wish me luck. Okay, here we go. So we've got our base part with the hole at the back. This little guy sat on the left-hand side of this platform, so we're just going to glue him on first. And then I'm going to glue these two pieces together next. Now I'm going to attach this whole piece onto here. Next, I'm going to put the rod that goes across the front. I'm going to say 15 millimeters. Okay, so these little bolts, I know it's hard to see, but they're actually flat on one side. And that's the side that's going to glue to the board. Glue that to the board. For the second side, I'm going to glue the wire into the hole first. I'm going to put glue on the flat side of this piece and glue on the wire on this side, and hopefully slide that in and have them both adhere. Okay, next let's put this little piece of housing over top. So when I made this piece, I actually folded it over a piece of that wire so that I had the indent of the wire in there. And I'm just going to fill that with glue and sit it on top of that rod. Scale is a little bit off on that, but that's okay. I'm all right with that. All right, then we're going to take this piece of wire. I'm going to insert it in the hole. Okay, so you can see that that wire comes up over top of the cylinder and sits in that forked piece that sits on top of this bar. Okay, the last little piece to go on is that little circle of cardstock on the top. And that's going to sit right on top of that piece of wire and over top of the cylinder. Like so. Okay, so now we just need to put these two pieces inside of the housing. And let's see, I think I'm going to start with the wood piece because it's far more difficult to hang on to. So that's just going to slide in like this. So I'm just going to put some glue around and we'll slide that in. And then we'll have to add our grill in front as well. I'm going to put the handle on now. Now I want to attach it to the top of the cabinet. So I'm going to take piece T and piece W. Now piece W is smaller in dimensions on the outside, but the inside cut is the exact same, and that's what I'm going to line up. I'm going to just glue those on top of each other with, of course, the smaller one on the top. And you will need some clamps or something to weight those down. So while those are drying, I'm going to take pieces X and Y, and all I'm going to do is curve off one of the edges of each of those pieces. So I find the easiest way to do that is to just drag it across a piece of sandpaper on the corner, and as you drag it, bring it to an upright position. That'll give a nice rounded edge at the top. And you might have to do that 5 or 6 times to get the desired curve that you're looking for. And so I'm just going to see how 5 does. So you can see there that there's a curve. I think I'm going to do it a couple more times. Start gluing pieces X and Y to this frame. And so I want them to stand up on end, first of all. Second of all, I want the curved edge to go to the outside. And thirdly, I want the bottom edge of that piece to match flush with the inside of the frame. I don't want it to go over because this area here is where the Victrola is. And we have to leave enough room because that is raised on this. So I'm going to do the two smaller pieces first. We'll glue them in place and then we'll add on our larger pieces. Now the two larger pieces are going to sit to the outside of the smaller ones. But I want to show you, because we do have to do just a little bit more sanding on these. So if I put this in place, you'll see that the rounded edge that I've added doesn't go all the way around because the pieces, of course, are blocks. So I want to round up each of these edges as well so that they then line up. So I'm just going to round off that corner just like so. So now you see that it is kind of rounded and kind of meets that joint a little better than just the squared off piece. So I'm going to do that on all four of those sides. Piece U is slightly smaller than the outside edge of this piece, but it's got enough of an edge on it that it'll sit on top on the inside. Place that on top. And I'm going to use a piece of masking tape over top of that just to keep it nice and tight while it dries. And then our last piece is piece V, and that's going to sit on top, sanded side up. And we'll use those same pieces of masking tape just to make sure that that stays down in place as well. All right, so there's our lid. We just need to attach it with a makeshift hinge. Now, the real one has an actual full hinge here. I don't have any hinges that are small enough to be able to do that. And so instead, I'm just going to make my own hinge. And I'm going to use a technique that I used when I made the refrigerator for the homestead house. And I'm just going to use a little piece of fabric and attach it underneath where you won't be able to see it. So back here on the back side of the Victrola casing, I'm going to put a piece of fabric, and then I'm going to attach the top piece of fabric to the underside of the lid. So I'm just going to put a little bead of glue there. I've cut this piece to be about 1/4 of an inch wide and the same distance across as the back of the casing. And I'm going to put it so that it's half of it is on the casing and the other half is just higher above the casing, as you can see. I'm also going to put another bead of glue over top just for extra hold. And then I'm going to attach, I'll fold that back and I'll put some glue on the top side here. Add my lid, and then using a toothpick, I'm going to push that fabric down onto the underside of the lid. So I'm going to go ahead now and stain it, and then the only thing we have left after that is to put some knobs on the front of the drawers. So I'm going to be using these tiny little wood beads and some stick pins. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to cut off the head of this stick pin about the same width as the bead itself. Okay, so as you can see, I've put the head of the pin through the little bead, and I'm going to hold on to that end, turn it upside down, and I'm going to fill this hole with wood glue. I put a little drop, and then I just push it in with the end of a toothpick. Once it's come all the way down, then you can add another. Then you can add another little drop, and so on until it's completely full. And you want to give that a chance to dry so that the pin doesn't come out. And then once it's dry, I'm going to paint it silver. Well, now our handles are attached, and that brings us to the end of this tutorial and this finished miniature. I hope you've enjoyed following along with me. It was an interesting one for sure, probably not something that you would find in too many homes. So I hope you got some value out of it, and we will see you next time. Bye-bye now.